Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, to a time before refrigerators, before microwaves, before even the concept of a drive-thru. We're going to immerse ourselves in the rather unappetizing reality of medieval diets, specifically for the vast majority of people, the peasants. Imagine it, if you will, waking up in a drafty, smoky hut, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and yesterday's hearth fire. Your stomach, a hollow drum, already begins its insistent rumble, a familiar companion that will stay with you for most of your waking hours. This isn't just a historical lesson, it's a sensory journey, one that will make you profoundly grateful for your modern pantry. A little reality check: if you were transported back to this era with your current eating habits, you probably wouldn't last a week. Your body, accustomed to a constant supply of varied nutrients, would simply revolt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stir on your straw mattress, the rough fabric scratching at your skin. Outside, the first faint light of dawn barely pierces the perpetual gloom of your village. Your first thought, as it almost always is, turns to food. Not a craving for something delicious, mind you, but a primal, insistent need to fuel your body for the back-breaking labor that awaits. Your breakfast, if you're lucky enough to have one, is already simmering in a pot over the embers of the fire gruel. It's a simple, unadorned concoction, usually made from oats, barley, or rye, boiled with water and perhaps a pinch of salt if your household can spare it. You ladle a portion into a wooden bowl, the warm, bland liquid offering little comfort beyond its heat. There are no exotic berries, no sugary toppings, no frothy lattes here. This is sustenance, pure and unadulterated, designed to provide just enough energy to get you through the morning's toil. The availability of different drinks also varied by region. In Northern Europe, where grapes were harder to cultivate, ale and cider were dominant. In Southern Europe, wine reigned supreme. This geographical divide shaped not only the drinks themselves, but also the cultural practices surrounding their consumption. As you swallow each mouthful, you feel the coarse texture against your tongue, a gritty reminder of the earth from which it came. This gruel in its various forms will be the cornerstone of your diet, day in and day out. It's cheap, it's filling, and it's relatively easy to prepare, making it the perfect staple for a population living on the edge of subsistence. You might occasionally add a few foraged greens, perhaps some wild garlic if you found it yesterday, to add a hint of flavor or a meager boost of vitamins. But mostly, unless it's just the grains. Imagine eating the same oatmeal as every single day for your entire life. Sounds like a diet challenge, right for you. It's just life. So as you raise your imaginary medieval goblet, whether it's filled with thick, earthy ale or a fine, spiced wine, remember that you're not just drinking. You're participating in a centuries-old tradition, a daily act of survival and celebration, shaped by the dangers of the environment and the ingenuity of human endeavor. It's a liquid journey, full of surprising flavors and profound historical significance. Your day is dictated by the sun and the seasons, and your diet reflects this brutal rhythm. Spring brings a fleeting hope of fresh greens and wild herbs, a welcome respite from the monotony of stored provisions. You spend hours scouring the edges of the forest, eyes peeled for anything edible, dandelions, nettles, wild sorrel. These aren't just additions, they are vital sources of nutrients that prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. You learn from a young age which plants are safe, which are poisonous, and which offer a little extra flavor. This knowledge is passed down through generations, a silent, critical encyclopedia of survival. You've navigated the murky waters of medieval hydration, understanding that your daily drink was as much about survival as it was about thirst. Now, let's sink our teeth into a topic that truly defined social standing in the medieval world meat. From the scrawniest chicken to the majestic stag, the type, quantity, and preparation of meat on your plate were a direct, undeniable declaration of your place in society. In an era where protein was often scarce, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, power, and a symbol of ultimate privilege. Summer, though demanding with its long days of fieldwork, offers a brief abundance, the grains you planted months ago begin to ripen, promising future harvests. You might find wild berries, blackberries, raspberries, a rare, sweet treat that bursts with flavor on your tongue. These moments of sweetness are fleeting, savored intensely, for you know they won't last. Vegetables, if you're fortunate enough to have a small plot, are limited to hardy root crops like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, along with cabbages and onions. These are grown not for culinary delight, but for their ability to store well through the lean months. You don't see the vibrant array of produce that fills modern supermarkets. Your garden is a functional space, yielding only what is essential for survival. Imagine one, if you will, the peasant's meager portion. For you, the common folk, meat was a rare and precious commodity. It wasn't a daily occurrence, or even a weekly one for many. Perhaps a few times a year, after a successful communal hunt, or if a domestic animal had to be culled due to age or illness. You might get a small, tough piece. This meat was often from pigs, which were relatively easy to raise, or from chickens. It was heavily salted or smoked to preserve it, meaning its texture was often stringy and its flavor intensely briny. You chew on a piece of salted pork, its saltiness making your eyes water, but you savor every bite, knowing how long it will be until the next. Autumn is a time of frantic activity. The harvest season, every able body, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, is in the fields, gathering the precious grains that will see you through the winter. This is when food is most plentiful, and you eat as much as you can, trying to build up reserves against the coming cold. Any surplus is carefully stored, dried, salted, or fermented to prevent spoilage. You might even get a rare taste of meat if a communal hunt is successful or if an animal needs to be culled before winter. But even then, it's a small portion, stretched as far as possible. Contrast this with the noble table. Here, meat was the star, the centerpiece of almost every meal, especially banquets. Roasts of venison, wild boar, beef, lamb, and a dizzying array of fowl, swans, peacocks, cranes, even smaller birds like larks, were presented with lavish ceremony. The sheer abundance was staggering, a visual feast designed to impress and intimidate. Imagine a whole roasted boar, its tusks still intact, brought in on a massive platter surrounded by herbs and vegetables. It's a display of power, a testament to the Lord's hunting prowess and his vast estates. Then comes winter, the cruelest season. The ground is frozen, nothing grows, and you rely entirely on your stored provisions. The gruel becomes even more central, often supplemented by dried peas or beans, providing much-needed protein. The taste of fresh food is a distant memory, replaced by the earthy, sometimes slightly rancid, flavors of preserved goods. You might occasionally get a piece of salted fish, a welcome change but still a far cry from a fresh catch. This is when the gnawing hunger is at its worst, when every meal is a calculation of calories, a desperate attempt to make it to spring. The type of meat consumed was also a clear class indicator. Wild game, like venison deer, boar, and even bear, was strictly reserved for the nobility. Hunting was not just a sport, it was a feudal rite, a leisure activity that also served to provide food for the Lord's table. Peasants caught poaching would face severe penalties, often death or mutilation. So, while you might occasionally glimpse a deer in the Lord's forest, you knew it was not for your plate. One common historical fact that often surprises people about medieval peasant diets is the sheer volume of grain consumed. It wasn't just gruel, bread. Often a dense, dark loaf made from rye or barley was another staple. Imagine a bread so heavy and coarse, it could practically double as a building material. You'd eat it with almost every meal, tearing off chunks to sop up whatever meager broth or stew might be available. This wasn't the fluffy white bread of today. It was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with fiber, even if it was a bit tough on the teeth. You'd be chewing for a while. Domesticated animals, like pigs, sheep, and cattle, were more widely available, but still largely controlled by the nobility or wealthy landowners. Peasants might keep a few chickens for eggs and occasional meat, or a pig that would be fattened and slaughtered once a year. The meat from these animals was often tougher, as they were not bred for tenderness like modern livestock. It required long, slow cooking to make it palatable, often in stews or pottages. Now, for a truly obscure detail, Did you know that medieval peasants sometimes ate pottage? It's similar to gruel, but often thicker, more of a stew, and could include whatever vegetables, herbs, or scraps of meat, if any were available. What makes it interesting is that it was often kept simmering on the hearth for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. Imagine a stew that's been cooking for a week, constantly being topped up. It was a practical way to ensure a continuous hot meal, but the flavors must have been complex, to say the least. It's the original perpetual stew. And honestly, it makes you wonder about the bacterial cultures thriving in there. Probably best not to think about it too much. The preparation of meat also differed significantly. For the peasant, meat was cooked simply, often boiled in a stew to tenderize it and extract every last bit of flavor and nutrient. For the nobility, meat was roasted, spiced, and often served with elaborate sauces. The cooks in noble households were masters of their craft, capable of transforming tough cuts into palatable dishes and making tender cuts truly exquisite. Imagine the rich aroma of roasted venison, its juices dripping, infused with the exotic spices you learned about earlier. The lack of variety in the peasant diet led to a surprising level of nutritional deficiency, even though they consumed a lot of calories from grains. While scurvy from lack of vitamin C is well known, other deficiencies were rampant. For example, pellagra, caused by a lack of niacin, was a problem, especially if maize corn became a primary staple, as it did in some regions later on. However, in the early medieval period, the reliance on barley and rye, which contained some niacin, mitigated this somewhat. Still, it was a constant struggle to get all the necessary vitamins and minerals. One common historical fact that often surprises people is the sheer variety of birds consumed by the medieval nobility. It wasn't just chicken and duck. Practically any bird that could be caught or raised was fair game. Swans, peacocks, herons, cranes, and even smaller birds like larks and sparrows were considered delicacies. These birds were often presented whole, sometimes with their feathers reattached, as a spectacular display at banquets. It's a level of avian diversity on the plate that would make a modern diner raise an eyebrow. You also learn to be incredibly resourceful. Nothing is wasted. Every scrap of food, every bone, every root is utilized. Animal bones are boiled down for broth, providing valuable fats and minerals. Leftover bread, if there is any, is dried and used as a thickener for stews. Even weeds that you might consider pests today are seen as potential food sources. This mindset of absolute utilization is ingrained in you from childhood, a stark contrast to the modern world's throwaway culture. You live in a world where food is precious, a gift from the earth, and its absence means suffering. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about umbrana? This was a dish made from the entrails and offal of animals, particularly pigs, often mixed with blood, breadcrumbs, and spices, then cooked into a sausage-like form. While it sounds rather unappetizing to modern sensibilities, it was a practical way to utilize every part of the animal, and was consumed by both peasants out of necessity, and sometimes even by nobles as a rustic delicacy or a way to show humility. Imagine a medieval version of black pudding or haggis, a testament to the nose-to-tail eating philosophy of the era. The concept of a balanced meal as we understand it simply doesn't exist for you. Your diet is balanced by necessity, by what the land can provide and what your labor can yield. Protein comes primarily from grains, peas, and beans. Meat is a luxury, reserved for special occasions or when hunting is successful. Even then, it's often tough, stringy, and heavily salted to preserve it. You wouldn't recognize the tender, marbled cuts of beef or chicken that fill our supermarket shelves. Your meat is lean, hard-won, and often tastes of the smoke or salt used to cure it. The concept of cuts of meat was also very different. There were no neatly packaged steaks or chicken breasts. Animals were butchered whole, and the various parts were distributed according to status. The lord would get the prime cuts, while the lesser members of the household and servants would receive the offal organs, feet, and less desirable parts. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal was utilized, a testament to the value of meat in a world of scarcity. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval peasant life is the communal nature of food. While each family had its own plot, the harvest often involved communal effort, and sharing was a necessity. If one family's crop failed, Their neighbors would often share what little they had. Understanding that their own survival might depend on such generosity in the future. This wasn't just altruism, it was a pragmatic form of social insurance in a world without safety nets. The preservation of meat was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, salting and smoking were the primary methods. Meat would be heavily salted, then often hung to dry or smoked over a fire. This process could make the meat incredibly tough and salty, requiring extensive soaking and cooking to make it edible. Imagine trying to rehydrate a piece of jerky that's been curing for months, then trying to make it taste good. It was a culinary feat. The preparation of food is also a time-consuming affair. There are no prepackaged meals or instant mixes. Grains must be ground, often by hand or at a communal mill. A laborious process that adds to your daily burden. Vegetables must be cleaned and chopped. Fires must be stoked and maintained. Cooking is not a quick task. It's a significant part of your day. An essential ritual that ensures your survival. You spend hours tending to the pot, stirring the gruel, watching the bread bake in the communal oven. The act of hunting was deeply ingrained in noble culture. It was a way to train for warfare, to demonstrate physical prowess, and to bond with other nobles. The hunt itself was a grand affair, involving hounds, horses, and a large retinue. The successful kill was a cause for celebration, and the meat would be brought back to the castle with great fanfare. You might hear the distant baying of hounds, the shouts of the hunters, and then the triumphant return, a deer slung over a horse destined for the Lord's table. The taste of your food is often bland, but you appreciate the subtle nuances. The earthiness of the root vegetables, the slight bitterness of the wild greens, the hearty chew of the dark bread. These are the flavors of your life, the tastes of survival. You don't crave variety, you crave sufficiency. A full stomach, even if it's filled with plain gruel, is a luxury, even for the nobility. Meat was often consumed in a way that would seem excessive today. Large portions, multiple types of meat at a single meal, and a general emphasis on quantity over variety in terms of non-meat items. This high-protein, high-fat diet, combined with a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, contributed to various diseases of affluence, such as gout, which was common among the wealthy. It's a strange irony too much of a good thing could be just as detrimental as too little. The role of fermentation in the medieval diet is also crucial, though often overlooked. To preserve food, you rely heavily on fermentation. Think about it. No refrigeration. So, vegetables like cabbage are turned into sauerkraut-like dishes. Grains are brewed into ale, and even some meats might be fermented. This not only preserved food, but also added beneficial probiotics, which, unknowingly, helped with digestion in a world where sanitation was, shall we say, rustic. It's a testament to human ingenuity in the face of limited technology. The concept of fish as a substitute for meat on fast days, as you recall, also led to some interesting culinary classifications. Beavers, otters, and even certain types of geese were sometimes considered fish because they lived in or near water, allowing them to be eaten when warm-blooded meat was forbidden. It's a delightful example of medieval culinary casuistry, finding loopholes in religious rules. And speaking of limited technology, the tools you use for eating are incredibly basic. A wooden spoon, a knife, and your hands. Forks are a novelty, mostly found among the very wealthy. And even then, they're often used for serving rather than eating. You eat directly from the communal pot or from your wooden bowl, sharing the warmth and the sustenance with your family. There's a certain intimacy to this communal eating, a shared struggle and shared comfort. The role of pigs in the medieval diet, for both peasants and nobles, cannot be overstated. Pigs were relatively easy to feed, often foraging in forests, and provided a good source of fat and protein. Every part of the pig was used, from the meat to the lard for cooking and preserving to the bristles for brushes. A pig slaughter was a significant event, ensuring a supply of meat for months. You might smell the distinct aroma of rendered lard, a sign of winter provisions being prepared. The concept of snacking is alien to you, and you eat 2, maybe 3, meals a day, dictated by the rhythm of labor and light. There are no mid-morning coffee breaks or afternoon treats. If you get hungry between meals, you simply endure it. Your body is accustomed to periods of hunger, a constant state of mild deprivation that shapes your very being. One academic debate still open to historians is the true impact of the Black Death on meat consumption patterns. After the plague decimated the population in the mid-14th century, there was a surplus of land and a shortage of labor. This led to an increase in wages for surviving peasants and, for a time, made meat more accessible to them as livestock became more plentiful relative to the population. Some historians argue this led to a brief golden age for peasant diets, while others contend that the economic upheaval and subsequent social changes quickly re-established the old hierarchies. It's a fascinating glimpse into how demographic shifts could temporarily alter dietary norms. Sometimes, you might get a taste of something truly special, something that breaks the monotony. Perhaps a wild mushroom, carefully identified to avoid the poisonous ones. Or a piece of cheese, if your village keeps a few dairy animals. These are rare moments, savored and remembered. A brief flicker of culinary delight in a life dominated by necessity. The practice of carving at the noble table was a highly skilled art, often performed by a designated carver. It was a public display of dexterity and knowledge, as the carver had to know the anatomy of various animals and how to expertly slice and serve each cut. It was a performance, part of the elaborate ritual of the feast. You watch in awe as the carver deftly slices a roasted capon, each piece falling perfectly onto the trencher. One academic debate still open to historians is whether the average medieval peasant consumed enough protein. While grains and legumes provided some, the overall intake of animal protein was significantly lower than in modern diets. Some historians argue that this led to widespread chronic fatigue and stunted growth, while others suggest that the combination of plant-based proteins, supplemented by occasional small game or fish, was just enough to sustain them, albeit without much surplus energy. It's a complex question, difficult to answer definitively without detailed records that simply don't exist. Even the way animals were raised and slaughtered reflected the times. Livestock often roamed freely, foraging for food, leading to leaner, tougher meat, compared to modern, grain-fed animals. Slaughtering was a messy, communal affair, often done seasonally to ensure a supply of fresh meat before the winter. It was a stark reminder of the connection between life, death, and sustenance. The sheer physical exertion of your daily life means you burn an enormous amount of calories. Plowing fields, harvesting crops, carrying water, chopping wood. Your body is a machine constantly in motion. This high-energy expenditure means that even a diet that seems meager by modern standards was barely enough to keep you going. You're not eating for pleasure. You're eating to survive, to have the strength to face another day of relentless labor. The use of verjuice, the acidic juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, was common in medieval cooking, particularly with meat dishes. It provided a sour counterpoint to the richness of the meat, and was used in sauces and marinades. It was a way to add brightness and cut through fat, similar to how lemon juice is used today. You taste a rich meat pie, its savory flavor balanced by a surprising tart tang from the verjuice, and the taste. Well, it's often described as bland, but that's from a modern perspective. For you, the taste of food is the taste of life, the warmth of the gruel, the satisfying chew of the dark bread, the earthy flavor of root vegetables. These are comforting, familiar tastes. You don't have the vast array of flavors and textures that modern diets offer, so your palate is attuned to the subtle differences in your limited fare. A slightly sweeter turnip, a particularly flavorful piece of dried fish. These are small joys. The concept of fresh meat was a luxury. Most meat was consumed soon after slaughter or heavily preserved. The idea of storing large quantities of fresh meat for extended periods was simply not feasible. This meant that the availability of truly fresh meat was often limited to hunting seasons or immediate post-slaughter periods. The constant threat of famine looms large over your life. A bad harvest, a prolonged drought, a devastating war. Any of these can plunge your village into starvation. You've seen it happen. The gaunt faces, the desperate eyes, the silent suffering. This fear shapes every decision you make about food, from how much to plant to how carefully to store your provisions. It's a stark reminder that your existence is precarious, always at the mercy of forces beyond your control. The medieval kitchen, particularly in a noble household, was a bustling, often chaotic place, centered around the preparation of meat. Large open hearths, spits for roasting, and massive cauldrons for boiling were essential. The air would be thick with smoke, the sizzling of fat, and the shouts of cooks and scullions. It was a hot, demanding environment, constantly working to feed the household. So, as you drift off to sleep, your stomach might still be rumbling, but you're grateful for the gruel, for the bread, for the simple sustenance that allowed you to survive another day. The medieval peasant diet wasn't about culinary exploration. It was about the brutal, beautiful art of staying alive. So, as you observe the various forms of meat on offer, from the peasant's tough, salted pork to the lord's magnificent roasted swan, you understand that meat in the medieval world was far more than just food. It was a powerful symbol of status, a testament to wealth, a reflection of religious observance, and a constant reminder of the intricate social hierarchy that governed every aspect of medieval life. It was, quite literally, the stuff of kings and the elusive dream of commoners. You leave behind the smoky, humble dwelling of the peasant, the lingering taste of bland gruel still on your tongue, and step into an entirely different world. The air here is cleaner, though still carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. Before you stands a grand hall, its stone walls towering, banners depicting heraldic beasts fluttering gently in the unseen drafts. You are now a guest, or perhaps a privileged observer, at the table of a medieval lord or lady. This isn't just a meal, it's a performance, a display of wealth, power, and social standing. Your peasant self would be utterly bewildered, perhaps even terrified, by the sheer abundance, the dazzling array of dishes that stretch before you. But as you draw closer, you begin to notice the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, paradoxes hidden beneath the glittering surface of aristocratic dining. You've explored the weighty significance of meat, understanding its role as a social barometer and a symbol of power in the medieval world. Now, as you shift your gaze from the roasted boar to the glistening platter, a different kind of protein takes center stage. Fish. In a world deeply intertwined with the church's calendar, and where fresh meat was often a luxury or a seasonal rarity, the bounty of rivers, lakes, and seas became an indispensable part of the medieval diet. A flexible and often ingenious fishy fix for the dietary restrictions and practical challenges of the era. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer quantity. Platters laden with roasted meats, venison, boar, swan, peacock, even the occasional badger, are paraded in, steaming and fragrant. Unlike the peasants' meager portions, here meat is king, queen, and the entire royal court. You see whole roasted animals, often reassembled with their feathers or fur, a bizarre and somewhat grotesque display designed to impress. Imagine a full-sized roasted swan, its neck elegantly curved, its feathers meticulously reattached. It's less about eating and more about showing off. A medieval equivalent of parking your luxury car right in the middle of the dining room. Imagine a typical Friday, or any of the countless fast days mandated by the church. The aroma of roasting meat is absent, replaced by the briny scent of the ocean or the fresh, clean smell of river water. For the vast majority of the population, fish wasn't just an alternative, it was a necessity. This meant a constant demand for aquatic provisions, shaping fishing practices, trade routes, and even culinary traditions. But before you even consider reaching for a succulent leg of lamb, you notice the order, the strict hierarchy of the table. You are seated on perhaps at a lower table, far from the elevated dais where the lord and lady preside. The best cuts, the finest wines, the most delicate pastries, all begin their journey at the high table. Only after the nobility has taken their fill do the dishes make their way down the ranks, often picked over and diminished by the time they reach you. It's a constant visual reminder of your place in the social order, a subtle message delivered with every passing dish. For the peasant, a fish often meant dried or salted varieties. Herring, in particular, was a staple, caught in vast quantities in the North Sea and preserved for distribution across Europe. Imagine a barrel of heavily salted herring, its scales dull, its flesh tough. You'd soak it overnight, sometimes for days, to draw out some of the intense saltiness, then boil or stew it. It wasn't gourmet, but it was protein, and it was permitted. You chew on a piece of dried cod, its fibrous texture a familiar companion on fast days, providing crucial sustenance. The taste of these medieval beverages would be quite different from what you're used to. Medieval ale was often unfiltered, cloudy, and might have had a slightly sour or yeasty taste. Wine without modern preservatives could turn quickly, and might have been more acidic or vinegary than contemporary wines. Imagine a drink that is both nourishing and slightly challenging to your modern palate. For the nobility, however, fish was transformed into an art form. While they also consumed preserved fish, their access to fresh catches was unparalleled. Salmon, trout, pike, carp, and even eels were prized. These were often sourced from the Lord's own fish ponds, meticulously managed to ensure a steady supply, or brought fresh from coastal towns by swift couriers. Imagine a perfectly poached salmon, its skin shimmering, served with a delicate saffron sauce, a testament to both the cook's skill and the Lord's wealth. The utensils are still rudimentary. While forks are beginning to make an appearance, particularly in Italy, they are far from common. You still mostly use a knife, often your own personal dagger, and your hands. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, serve as edible plates, soaking up the juices and gravies before being eaten or, more commonly, given to the poor or to dogs. It's a surprisingly practical, if somewhat messy, system. You find yourself wiping your greasy fingers on the fine linen tablecloth, a habit that would earn you a stern glance from a modern etiquette coach. The management of fish ponds was a significant undertaking for noble estates and monasteries. These artificial ponds were carefully constructed and stocked, providing a reliable source of fresh fish, especially during Lent and other fast periods. They were a form of living larder, ensuring that even far inland, fresh fish could be on the table. You might see a monk, quietly tending to the fish in his monastery's pond. A vital part of their self-sufficiency, the variety of meats is astounding. But it's not just about what animal is served, it's about how it's prepared. Spices, incredibly expensive and rare, are used liberally. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These aren't just flavorings, they are status symbols. A dish heavily spiced proclaims the host's wealth and ability to afford such luxuries. You taste a roasted boar, its rich, gamey flavor cut by a surprising sweetness from honey and a complex warmth from a blend of spices. It's a far cry from the salted, tough meat of the peasant's table. The sheer variety of aquatic life consumed is astonishing. It wasn't just what we consider fish today. As you recall from earlier, anything that lived in water was often fair game on fast days. This included beavers, otters, and even certain types of waterfowl like puffins or geese that spent significant time in water. The logic was simple if it came from the water. It was fish. It's a delightful example of medieval culinary classification. A clever workaround for religious rules, fish, too, plays a significant role, especially on the numerous fast days mandated by the church. While peasants might get dried or salted fish, here you find fresh salmon, trout, and even exotic imports like sturgeon. These are often prepared with elaborate sauces, showcasing the cook's skill and the Lord's access to fresh waterways or distant markets. Imagine a perfectly poached salmon, glistening on a silver platter, surrounded by herbs and delicate sauces. It's a testament to the logistical prowess required to bring such fresh ingredients to the table. Preparation methods for fish varied widely. Boiling and stewing were common, especially for preserved fish, to rehydrate and tenderize it. Fresh fish might be poached, fried, or roasted. Spices, as always, were used liberally by the nobility to enhance flavor and mask any lingering fishiness. Imagine a rich fish stew infused with ginger and cinnamon, its aroma filling the kitchen. Vegetables are present, but often as accompaniments rather than main courses. Root vegetables like carrots and parsnips are still common, but you also see more delicate greens, perhaps from the Lord's private garden. However, there's a curious disdain for raw vegetables. The belief was that raw foods were unhealthy, difficult to digest, and could cause illness. So most vegetables are boiled, stewed, or roasted, often to the point of mushiness. A fresh, crisp salad is an alien concept. You might see a few herbs scattered for garnish, but biting into a raw carrot is simply not done. One common historical fact that often surprises people is the sheer scale of the medieval fishing industry. Particularly for herring, vast fleets would sail into the North Sea, bringing back enormous catches that were then salted and distributed across the continent. This trade was vital to the economy of many coastal towns and provided a crucial protein source for millions. It was a massive logistical operation, driven by religious observance and the need for affordable, storable food. Fruits, when in season, are enjoyed. but again, often cooked or preserved. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums are common. They might be baked into pies, stewed with spices, or dried for later consumption. Fresh fruit is a delightful, but brief indulgence. You might pick up a ripe apple, its sweetness a welcome contrast to the savory dishes. But you're unlikely to see a fruit bowl overflowing with a diverse selection. Now, for a truly obscure detail did you know about stockfish? This was unsalted cod or other white fish, dried by cold air and wind on wooden racks, particularly in Norway. The drying process made it incredibly hard, almost like wood, and it could be stored for years and before cooking. It had to be beaten with a mallet and soaked for days to rehydrate. Imagine trying to prepare a meal from a piece of fish that feels like a plank of wood. It was a testament to the extreme measures taken for preservation and the enduring hunger for protein. The most striking difference, perhaps, is the bread. While peasants eat dark, coarse loaves, the nobility enjoys fine, white bread made from sifted wheat flour. This manchet bread is a symbol of purity and status, a stark contrast to the black bread of the common folk. It's lighter, softer, and more refined, a testament to the labor and resources required to produce it. You tear off a piece, its delicate texture melting on your tongue, a stark reminder of the social chasm that separates you from the fields where the wheat was grown. The availability of fish also depended heavily on geography. Coastal communities and those living near major rivers or lakes had more access to fresh fish. Inland regions relied more on preserved fish, which was transported over long distances. This created regional variations in diet, with some areas having a much greater reliance on fish than others. Drinks are also a world apart. While the peasant relies on ale, the nobility drinks wine, and not just any wine, but fine vintages often imported from France or Italy. The wine flows freely, often watered down for younger drinkers or those who wish to remain somewhat sober. Mead, a fermented honey drink, is also popular, especially in northern regions. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed at these feasts is staggering. It's a wonder anyone could walk straight after a few hours. Imagine a medieval banquet as a very long, very boozy dinner party, where everyone is trying to outdrink each other. The role of fish in providing essential nutrients, particularly protein and fats, was critical, especially during periods when meat was forbidden. Fish provided a valuable alternative, ensuring that people, particularly the nobility, could still maintain a relatively rich diet even during fasts. For the peasantry, it was often the only source of animal protein they regularly consumed. Sweet treats, though less refined than modern desserts, are a highlight. Spiced cakes, fruit tarts, and custards are common. Sugar, imported and incredibly expensive, is used sparingly, often mixed with honey. Marzipan, a paste made from almonds and sugar, is a particular luxury, often molded into elaborate shapes, miniature castles, animals, or even allegorical figures. These subtleties are not just food, they are edible art designed to entertain and impress. You bite into a marzipan rose, its delicate sweetness a rare indulgence. The church's influence on diet meant that the demand for fish was predictable and constant. This predictability allowed for the development of sophisticated fishing techniques and trade networks. It was a religious imperative that shaped an entire industry, a powerful example of faith influencing economics. One common historical fact that often surprises people is the importance of sops in medieval noble dining. Sops were pieces of bread, often toasted, that were dipped into wine, soup, or gravy. They were a way to consume liquids and sauces without spilling. Given the lack of proper cutlery, it's like the original breadstick, only a lot more absorbent and less crunchy. You'd see nobles elegantly dunking their bread, a practice that might seem uncouth today but was perfectly acceptable then. Even the presentation of fish at noble tables could be elaborate. Whole fish might be served, sometimes gilded or decorated with edible flowers. Sauces, often brightly colored with saffron or other dyes, would accompany the dishes, making them visually appealing. It was a way to elevate a humble ingredient into a grand culinary statement. You see a large carp, its skin glistening, adorned with herbs, a true centerpiece. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about blancmange? No, not the wobbly, sweet dessert we know today. Medieval blancmange was a savory dish, Typically made from shredded chicken or fish, rice, sugar, and almond milk, often colored with saffron or other natural dyes. It was a delicate, often bland, dish considered suitable for the sick or those recovering, but also a popular dish at feasts. Imagine a creamy yet slightly sweet yellow chicken porridge. It sounds utterly bizarre to our modern palates, but it was a sign of refined taste and careful preparation. It's the kind of dish that makes you think, well, that's different. The concept of fish days extended beyond just Fridays and Lent. Many saints' days and vigils also required abstinence from meat, meaning that fish was a regular feature of the medieval diet for a significant portion of the year. This constant cycle of fish and meat days meant that medieval cooks had to be incredibly versatile, able to prepare both types of protein with skill and creativity. The paradox of noble dining lies in its opulence masking underlying health issues. While they had access to vast quantities of food, their diet was often unbalanced. They consumed excessive amounts of meat, leading to conditions like gout, a painful form of arthritis caused by high uric acid levels. Their diet was also low in fiber and fresh produce, contributing to digestive problems. The rich, spiced foods, while delicious, were often heavy and difficult to digest. So, while they avoided the nutritional deficiencies of the peasants, they faced their own set of dietary woes. It's like having all the money in the world but only being able to buy steak and cake. One academic debate still open to historians is the extent to which the medieval reliance on fish contributed to the overall health of the population. While fish provided essential proteins and omega-3 fatty acids, though this wasn't understood at the time, the heavy reliance on salted and dried fish, combined with a lack of fresh produce, could also have led to high sodium intake and other nutritional imbalances. Some scholars argue that the benefits outweighed the drawbacks, while others point to potential long-term health issues. It's a complex question, highlighting the trade-offs inherent in medieval dietary practices. The elaborate presentation of food was almost as important as the food itself. Dishes were often dyed vibrant colors using saffron yellow, spinach green, or even blood red. Pastries were shaped into intricate designs. The master of the feast would oversee the entire production, ensuring every dish was perfect, every servant in place. It was a spectacle, a theatrical event designed to reinforce the lord's status and entertain his guests. You watch as a server meticulously places a gilded pie on the table, its crust adorned with tiny, edible flowers. The fishing methods themselves were often rudimentary but effective. Nets, traps, and simple lines were used. For larger catches, communal efforts were common. The dangers of fishing, from treacherous seas to unpredictable weather, were ever present, making it a hazardous but essential occupation. You might imagine the hardy fishermen battling the waves, bringing in their precious cargo. Despite the abundance, food preservation was still a major concern. Even for the wealthy, fresh ingredients were seasonal and perishable. Salting, smoking, and drying were still vital methods. Meat was often heavily salted to prevent spoilage, which meant it could be incredibly tough and required extensive soaking before cooking. Imagine trying to make a delicious meal out of something that tastes like it's been marinating in a salt lick for months. It required considerable culinary skill to make these preserved ingredients palatable. The preservation of fish, like meat, was a matter of survival. Salting involved packing fish in barrels with layers of salt. Drying involved hanging fish in the open air, often in cold, windy climates. Smoking added flavor and further preserved the fish. These methods were crucial for ensuring a year-round supply of protein. The concept of a course as we know it was also different. Instead of distinct courses served one after another, medieval feasts often presented many dishes simultaneously, allowing diners to pick and choose. This service à la française meant the table was groaning under the weight of food, a visual feast in itself. You gaze at the table, overwhelmed by the sheer number of options, a true smorgasbord of medieval delights. The taste of medieval fish, especially preserved varieties, would be quite strong and salty to your modern palate. Fresh fish, however, would have been a delicate pleasure, a welcome change from the heavy meats and bland grains. Imagine the clean, sweet taste of a freshly caught trout, cooked simply over an open fire. Feasts were also an opportunity for entertainment. Minstrels would play music, jesters would perform, and sometimes even elaborate plays or mummings would take place between courses. The food was part of the entertainment, but it wasn't the only focus. It was a multi-sensory experience, designed to delight and impress. You hear the faint strains of a lute as you reach for another piece of roasted fowl. The sheer quantity of fish consumed meant that medieval people were often more familiar with different species of fish than many modern individuals. They knew which fish were best for salting, which for drying, and which were most prized fresh. This deep knowledge of aquatic life was essential for survival and culinary practice. The role of the church extended even to the noble table. Fast days, when meat was forbidden, were strictly observed, even by the wealthy. This meant a greater reliance on fish, eggs, and dairy products. However, the nobility often found ingenious ways to circumvent the spirit of the law while adhering to the letter. For example, some wealthy individuals would classify certain animals, like beavers or puffins, as fish because they lived in water, allowing them to be eaten on fast days. It's a delightful example of medieval legal loopholes and culinary creativity. So, as you observe the medieval table, whether it's a peasant's humble meal or a noble's elaborate feast, you realize that fish was far more than just food for fast days. It was a vital, versatile, and often surprisingly luxurious component of the medieval diet, a testament to human ingenuity in adapting to religious dictates and environmental realities. From river to plate, fish truly was a medieval fix. One academic debate still open to historians is the true impact of medieval noble diets on their overall health and lifespan. While they avoided the immediate starvation faced by peasants, their rich, high-fat, high-protein, and low-fiber diets, combined with a lack of understanding of hygiene and disease, likely contributed to various ailments. Some argue that the constant feasting and the prevalence of gout and other diseases of kings actually shortened their lives, despite their privileged access to food. Others contend that their access to a greater variety of nutrients, even if unbalanced, still gave them an advantage over the peasantry. It's a complex interplay of diet, lifestyle, and medical knowledge that makes a definitive conclusion challenging. You've explored the vital role of fish, a flexible protein source that adapted to both religious mandates and practical needs. Now, let's turn to the often overlooked, yet fundamentally important, components of the medieval diet: fruits and vegetables. Forget the vibrant, year-round produce aisle of your modern supermarket. In the medieval world, the availability of these fresh foods was dictated by the harsh realities of the seasons, and the concept of refined sugar as a common sweetener was almost entirely absent. Your palate, accustomed to modern sweetness, is about to experience a profound recalibration. The sheer logistics of feeding a medieval noble household were immense. A large castle might house hundreds of people: family, servants, guards, and guests. Providing 3 meals a day for such a multitude required a massive infrastructure of kitchens, pantries, cellars, and a small army of cooks, scullions, and servers. Imagine the planning, the procurement, the sheer amount of work involved in keeping such a machine running. It was a constant, monumental task, a testament to the organizational skills of the household staff. Imagine stepping into a medieval garden, not a manicured flower bed, but a practical space teeming with life. Here, every plant serves a purpose. For the peasant, this small plot of land next to their hut was a lifeline. You'd cultivate hardy root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, along with cabbages, onions, and leeks. These weren't just side dishes, they were crucial sources of vitamins and fiber, often boiled into thick pottages or stews, providing bulk and essential nutrients to supplement the omnipresent gruel. You pull a gnarled turnip from the soil, its earthy scent filling your nostrils, knowing it will be a cornerstone of your evening meal. So, as the feast winds down and the remnants of the lavish meal are cleared away, you reflect on the stark contrast between the two worlds you've witnessed. The peasant's diet, a brutal struggle for survival, defined by scarcity and monotony. The noble's diet, a flamboyant display of power and luxury, yet not without its own hidden drawbacks. Both, in their own way, were shaped by the unforgiving realities of the medieval world, where food was never just sustenance, but a powerful symbol of status, faith, and the eternal dance between abundance and want. The variety of vegetables was far more limited than today. Leafy greens like spinach, kale, and various wild greens, dandelions, nettles. Sorrel were consumed, especially in spring when fresh growth was abundant. These were often gathered from the wild, a dangerous but necessary foraging activity. Imagine the constant search, your eyes scanning the ground for edible leaves, knowing that a mistake could mean illness or worse. Having experienced the stark realities of both peasant and noble tables, your senses are now attuned to the subtle, yet profound, differences that define medieval cuisine. As you linger in the grand hall, the lingering aroma of roasted meats and fine wines begins to give way to something else. Something sharper, more exotic, almost intoxicating. It's the scent of spices, and for the medieval palate, these weren't just flavorings, they were a declaration, a statement of wealth, power, and a connection to a world far beyond the castle walls. You are about to embark on a journey that stretches across continents, a quest for flavor that came at an astonishing cost. For the nobility, their gardens were larger, more varied, and often enclosed within castle walls. They might cultivate a wider range of herbs and more delicate greens, but the fundamental approach to vegetables remained similar. They were often cooked extensively. The belief persisted that raw foods were unhealthy, difficult to digest, and could cause illness. So salads as you know them were virtually non-existent. Vegetables were boiled, stewed, roasted, or even fried, often to a soft, almost mushy consistency. You watch as a cook meticulously boils a basket of carrots, their vibrant orange fading to a duller hue as they soften. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer effort involved in bringing a pinch of black pepper to this table. It didn't just appear, it traveled thousands of miles, across treacherous seas and dusty desert trails, changing hands countless times, each transaction adding to its already exorbitant price. For you, the modern consumer, spices are a supermarket aisle, a convenience. For the medieval noble, they were a treasure, guarded jealously, traded like gold, and often worth more than their weight in silver. Fruits were a seasonal delight, savored intensely during their brief window of ripeness. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, and berries. Strawberries, raspberries, blackberries were common. For the peasant, these were often foraged from wild trees or cultivated in small orchards. They were eaten fresh when available, but more often preserved through drying or cooking into tarts and compotes to extend their shelf life. You bite into a ripe apple, its crisp sweetness a burst of pure joy, knowing this fleeting pleasure won't last. The most common, yet still incredibly valuable, spice you encounter is black pepper. Its pungent, warming bite is ubiquitous in noble dishes, used not just to enhance flavor but often to mask the taste of meat that might be less than fresh. Remember that point about food preservation? Even with salting and smoking, meat could still turn quickly, and a liberal dusting of pepper was a culinary camouflage, a way to make questionable cuts more palatable. You watch as a cook, with almost reverent care, grinds peppercorns into a fine powder, the sharp aroma making your eyes water slightly. This isn't just seasoning, it's a form of medieval food insurance. For the nobility, fruits might be served fresh at feasts, but they were also frequently cooked into pies, tarts, or preserves, often sweetened with honey or the incredibly expensive imported sugar. Marzipan made from almonds and sugar was a particular luxury, molded into elaborate shapes for banquets. Imagine a platter of perfectly formed marzipan fruits, almost too beautiful to eat, a testament to the confectioner's skill and the lord's wealth. Cinnamon, with its sweet, woody fragrance, is another staple. You find it in savory dishes like that roasted boar you tasted earlier, as well as in the sweet pastries and custards. It's a versatile spice, prized for its warmth and its ability to transform even the simplest ingredients into something more luxurious. Imagine the comforting scent of a spiced apple tart, the cinnamon mingling with the sweetness of honey. It's a rare moment of pure indulgence. The most striking absence in the medieval diet, especially for the common person, was refined sugar. Sugarcane was a rare and expensive import, primarily from the Middle East and later from newly established plantations in the Mediterranean. It was a luxury item, used sparingly by the very wealthy, often for medicinal purposes or as a display of extreme extravagance. For most people, sweetness came from natural sources. honey, fruits, and sometimes fruit syrups. You taste a medieval pastry, its sweetness subtle, derived from honey, a far cry from the intense, almost overwhelming sweetness of modern desserts. Cloves, tiny and intensely aromatic, are used sparingly. Their powerful flavor capable of dominating a dish if overdone. You might find them studded into an orange, a festive decoration, or lending a deep, resonant note to a rich stew. Their sharp, almost medicinal scent is unmistakable, a reminder of their distant tropical origins. Nutmeg and mace, which comes from the same fruit as nutmeg, add a delicate, earthy sweetness, often grated fresh over dishes at the table. A final flourish of luxury, honey was the primary sweetener for all social classes. Bees were kept in many households, and wild honey was also collected. It was used in cooking, in drinks like mead, and as a natural preservative. Its complex flavor, varying with the flowers the bees visited, was the dominant sweet note in medieval cuisine. Imagine the rich floral taste of fresh honey, a precious commodity in a world without widespread sugar. Ginger, both fresh and dried, brings a fiery kick, a counterpoint to the richness of the meats. It's particularly popular in sauces and marinades, adding a zing that awakens the palate. You taste a ginger-infused sauce with a piece of roasted chicken, the spice cutting through the fat, leaving a pleasant warmth in your mouth. It's a testament to the medieval cook's understanding of flavor balance, even with a limited palette of ingredients. One common historical fact that often surprises people is the importance of herbs in medieval cooking. Not just for flavor, but for their perceived medicinal properties. Beyond common culinary herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, many wild herbs were used. These were believed to aid digestion, cure ailments, and balance the body's humors. A medieval garden was as much an apothecary as it was a kitchen garden. You might see a cook adding a handful of fresh mint to a stew, not just for taste, but for its supposed digestive benefits. Saffron, the most expensive spice of all, is used not just for its subtle honey-like flavor, but for its vibrant golden color. A pinch of saffron can transform a bland rice dish into a visually stunning sun-kissed creation. It's a sign of ultimate luxury, a spice so precious that only the wealthiest could afford it. Imagine a dish of blancmange, its creamy texture now infused with a radiant yellow hue from the saffron, looking almost like liquid gold. It's a feast for the eyes as much as for the stomach. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about pot herbs? This term referred to any leafy green vegetable or herb that was typically boiled in a pot, often as part of a pottage or stew. It encompassed a wide range of wild and cultivated greens, many of which are rarely eaten today, like mallow, fat hen, or good King Henry. These humble pot herbs were crucial for providing vitamins and minerals, especially during the lean months. Imagine a stew filled with a mix of unfamiliar, slightly bitter greens, providing essential nutrients. But where did these spices come from? This is where the story gets truly epic. They weren't grown in European fields. They came from the distant, mysterious lands of the East, India, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the Spice Islands, Indonesia, and beyond. The trade routes were long, arduous, and incredibly dangerous. Caravans laden with precious spices traversed deserts, braving bandits and harsh elements. Ships sailed across vast oceans, facing storms, pirates, and the unknown. Each leg of the journey added to the price, making spices a commodity more valuable than many precious metals. The merchants who controlled this trade, primarily Italians from Venice and Genoa, grew incredibly rich. They were the gatekeepers, the middlemen who held the keys to the world's most coveted flavors. They established trading posts, negotiated with local rulers, and built vast commercial empires on the back of demand for these exotic goods. Imagine the bustling markets of Venice, filled with the intoxicating aromas of spices, the cacophony of languages, the constant haggling over prices. It was a hub of global commerce, driven by the desire for flavor. One common historical fact that often surprises people is that spices were not primarily used to mask the taste of rotten meat, as is a popular myth. While they certainly could help improve the flavor of less than fresh ingredients, their primary use was as a status symbol and for their perceived medicinal properties. Spices were believed to aid digestion, balance the humors of the body, and even cure various ailments. A heavily spiced dish was not just delicious, It was considered healthy and beneficial. So, while your modern mind might think of it as a cover-up, the medieval mind saw it as a form of culinary wellness. The concept of 5 a day would have been utterly alien. While vegetables were a significant part of the peasant diet, they were often cooked to oblivion, potentially diminishing their nutritional value. Fruits were a treat, not a daily staple. This limited access to fresh, raw produce contributed to various nutritional deficiencies, even if people weren't starving. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about grains of paradise? This lesser-known spice, related to ginger and cardamom, came from West Africa and was popular in medieval Europe before black pepper became more widely available and affordable. It offered a peppery, slightly citrusy, and floral flavor. It was often used as a substitute for pepper or to add a unique complexity to dishes. Imagine a dish with a subtle, exotic warmth that isn't quite pepper, not quite ginger, but something entirely new. It's a forgotten flavor, a ghost of medieval gastronomy. The taste of medieval fruits and vegetables might also surprise you. Without modern selective breeding, many varieties would have been smaller, tougher, and less sweet than their contemporary counterparts. Apples might be more tart, carrots more fibrous. You'd appreciate the subtle natural flavors, unmasked by artificial sweeteners or intense processing. The scarcity of spices meant that even a small amount was a significant investment. A lord might spend a fortune on a year's supply of pepper, a sum that could otherwise feed dozens of peasant families. This investment was not just for culinary pleasure, it was a display of power. To serve heavily spiced food at your table was to announce your wealth and influence to all your guests. It was a tangible manifestation of your reach, your ability to command goods from the far corners of the earth. The role of legumes, like peas and beans, was also crucial. These were easy to grow, stored well, and provided valuable protein and fiber, especially for the peasantry. They were often dried and added to pottages, forming a significant part of the daily caloric intake. Imagine a hearty pea and bean stew, thick and filling, a staple that sustained millions. The cooks in noble households were highly skilled artisans, often trained in the art of using these precious ingredients. They understood the delicate balance required to enhance, rather than overwhelm, the natural flavors of the food. They experimented with combinations, creating complex sauces and elaborate dishes that showcased their mastery of spices. Imagine a medieval chef, carefully measuring out a tiny pinch of saffron, knowing its immense value, treating it with the reverence it deserved. The practice of gleaning was common after harvests, where peasants were allowed to collect leftover grains or vegetables from the fields. This provided an additional, albeit meager, source of food that would otherwise go to waste. It was a testament to the efficiency and resourcefulness required for survival. The desire for spices also fueled exploration and conquest. The search for direct access to the Spice Islands, bypassing the Venetian and Genoese middlemen, was a major motivator for the Age of Discovery. Columbus sailed west looking for a new route to the Indies, hoping to find a shortcut to the source of these valuable commodities. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, opening a sea route to India. The quest for flavor literally reshaped the world map. It's quite remarkable to think that your humble spice rack has such a dramatic historical lineage. The importance of wild foraging cannot be overstated. For peasants, the woods and fields were extensions of their pantry, berries, nuts, mushrooms carefully identified, and various wild greens supplemented their cultivated crops, providing crucial dietary diversity and nutrients. This knowledge of the natural world was passed down through generations, a vital skill for survival. The intellectual understanding of spices was also deeply intertwined with medieval medicine. The theory of humors, which posited that the body was made up of 4 basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, heavily influenced dietary practices. Spices were categorized by their hot or cold and wet or dry properties, and used to balance the humors. For example, ginger, being hot and dry, might be prescribed to someone suffering from a cold and wet imbalance. This wasn't just about taste, it was about maintaining health and preventing illness. One academic debate still open to historians is the true extent of vitamin deficiencies among the medieval population, particularly scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, and rickets. Vitamin D deficiency, While some sources suggest widespread issues, others argue that the consumption of wild greens, root vegetables, and even weak ale, which could contain some vitamins, provided just enough to prevent widespread acute cases. Though chronic, milder deficiencies were likely common. It's a complex picture, difficult to fully reconstruct from the limited historical records. The very act of grinding spices was a task of significance. Whole spices were more stable and retained their potency longer. So, cooks would often grind them fresh, just before use, to maximize their flavor and aroma. This meant a constant, rhythmic pounding and grinding, a sound that would have been a familiar backdrop to any medieval kitchen. You hear the dull thud of a mortar and pestle, the release of aromatic oils into the air. The medieval approach to food was one of practicality and necessity. Every plant, every fruit, every vegetable had a purpose, whether for sustenance, medicine, or preservation. There was little room for purely aesthetic or indulgent consumption, especially for the majority of the population. The demand for spices also led to widespread adulteration. Dishonest merchants would mix expensive spices with cheaper, less flavorful alternatives, or even with inert substances like dust or groundnuts to increase their profits. This made it difficult for buyers to know if they were getting genuine, unadulterated spices, adding another layer of risk to the trade. It was the medieval equivalent of food fraud, a constant battle between quality and deception. Even the presentation of fruits and vegetables at noble tables, while more elaborate, still emphasized their natural form or their transformation through cooking. They weren't seen as mere garnishes, but as integral components of the meal, albeit often overshadowed by the grand meat dishes. Despite their high cost, spices were sometimes used in surprising ways. For example, they were occasionally used to perfume baths or to scent clothing, further demonstrating their value and the desire to surround oneself with luxury. Imagine the subtle aroma of cloves or cinnamon clinging to a noble's robes, a fragrant echo of their lavish meals. The absence of sugar also meant that the medieval palate was attuned to different kinds of sweetness. The natural sugars in fruits, the complex sweetness of honey, and even the subtle sweetness of certain root vegetables would have been more pronounced and appreciated. It's a reminder of how our tastes are shaped by the foods we consume. The very act of consuming spices was a multi-sensory experience, far beyond just taste. The aroma, the visual appeal especially with saffron, the warming sensation, all contributed to the perception of a dish as luxurious and refined. It was a complete sensory package, designed to elevate the dining experience. You close your eyes, inhaling the complex bouquet of a spiced dish, feeling the warmth spread through you. So, as you taste the subtle sweetness of a medieval apple or the earthy flavor of a boiled turnip, remember that you are experiencing a diet shaped by the rhythms of nature and the absence of modern conveniences. It was a world where sweetness was a rare gift, and where every fruit and vegetable, no matter how humble, played a crucial role in the daily struggle for survival. One academic debate still open to historians is the extent to which spices truly masked spoilage versus simply enhancing flavor. While the popular narrative often emphasizes the masking of bad tastes, many scholars argue that medieval people were quite adept at identifying spoiled food, and that spices were primarily used for their flavor, perceived medicinal benefits, and as a status symbol. The idea that all medieval food was rotten and needed heavy spicing to be edible is largely a modern exaggeration, though some level of spoilage was certainly more common than today. It's a nuanced discussion, highlighting the complexities of interpreting historical culinary practices. You've explored the subtle flavors of fruits and vegetables, and the surprising absence of refined sugar, understanding how the seasons dictated the medieval palate. Now, let's delve into a far more ominous aspect of medieval dining, the constant, lurking threat of spoiled food and the ingenious, often unappetizing, methods people devised to keep it from killing them. In a world without refrigeration, every meal was a gamble, and the dark side of food was a very real, very dangerous reality. The cultural significance of spices extended beyond the dining table. They were used in religious ceremonies, in perfumes, and as gifts. They were a symbol of exotic lands, of distant adventures, and of the vast interconnected world that was slowly beginning to reveal itself. To possess spices was to possess a piece of that distant, fascinating world. Imagine, for a moment, the fear that would accompany every bite. You've just witnessed a feast, or perhaps shared a humble pottage, but in the back of your mind, a chilling question always lingers. Is this safe to eat? Without modern understanding of bacteria and sanitation, the medieval world was a breeding ground for foodborne illnesses. A warm day, a slight oversight in preparation, and your meal could become a silent killer. The subtle smell of decay, the slightly off taste, these were not just unpleasantries, they were warnings of potential death. Even the way spices were stored was important. They were kept in special containers, often locked away, to protect them from theft and to preserve their potency. Imagine a lord's spice cabinet, a small, heavily guarded treasure chest filled with precious powders and fragrant barks. It was a tangible representation of his wealth and his connection to global trade networks. Meat, as you know, was highly prized but incredibly perishable. Once an animal was slaughtered, the race against spoilage began. The primary methods of preservation were salting, smoking, and drying. Salting involved packing meat in vast quantities of salt, drawing out the moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. Imagine barrels upon barrels of salted pork or beef, stacked in a cool cellar, their briny aroma filling the air. This meat, while preserved, was often incredibly tough and salty, requiring extensive soaking in water before it could be cooked. You chew on a piece of salted beef, its extreme saltiness making your lips pucker, but you know it's the only way to keep it from rotting. So, as you savor the complex flavors of a spiced medieval dish, remember the incredible journey each particle has undertaken. From distant lands, across perilous routes, through the hands of countless merchants. These precious commodities arrived at the noble table, not just as food, but as symbols of power, health, and a world far larger and more interconnected than you might have imagined. The cost wasn't just monetary, it was the cost of human endeavor, risk, and the insatiable human desire for something extraordinary. Smoking involved hanging meat over slow-burning fires, allowing the smoke to permeate the flesh, adding flavor and acting as a preservative. This was common for hams, sausages, and fish. Imagine the smoky, pungent aroma of a medieval smokehouse, thick with the scent of curing meat. It was a laborious process, but essential for extending the shelf life of valuable protein. You've tasted the bland gruel of the peasant and savored the spiced extravagance of the noble. You've journeyed through the perilous trade routes that brought exotic flavors to medieval tables. Now, prepare to navigate an even more intricate landscape, the spiritual calendar that dictated when and what you could eat. In the medieval world, food was not merely sustenance or a symbol of status, it was deeply intertwined with faith, a constant dance between earthly desires and divine decree. Your stomach, it seems, was also subject to the whims of the church. Drying, particularly for fish and some fruits, involved simply exposing the food to air and sun or wind. Stockfish, as you learned earlier, was a prime example unsalted cod, dried until it was hard as wood. This method removed almost all moisture, making the food virtually impervious to spoilage, but also incredibly difficult to rehydrate and prepare. You see dried apples, shriveled and dark, a far cry from their fresh, crisp counterparts, but a vital source of sweetness in winter. Imagine waking on a Friday, or perhaps during the solemn season of Lent. The air in the castle kitchen, usually thick with the aroma of roasting meat, is noticeably different. There's a distinct absence of the rich, savory scents you've come to associate with noble dining. Today, meat is forbidden. This isn't a dietary choice, it's a religious obligation, a penance, a way to show devotion and humility. For almost half the year, the medieval calendar mandated days of abstinence from meat. That's right, nearly 160 days out of 365 were fast days. This didn't mean going without food entirely, but rather abstaining from the flesh of warm-blooded animals. Grains, the backbone of the peasant diet, were susceptible to mold, pests, and dampness. They had to be stored in dry, well-ventilated granaries, constantly monitored for signs of spoilage. A bad harvest, or improper storage, could mean widespread famine. Imagine the constant worry, checking your stored grain, hoping no rats have gotten in. No dampness has caused mold to bloom. So, what did you eat on these days? Fish became paramount, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest lord. Everyone turned to the rivers, lakes, and seas. For the peasant, this might mean a meager portion of dried or salted herring, perhaps caught locally if they lived near water. It was a tough, salty affair, often soaked overnight to make it palatable. You chew on a piece of dried cod, its fibrous texture and intense saltiness a stark contrast to the fresh fish you might occasionally find. Dairy products, like milk, spoiled quickly. This is why milk was often consumed immediately or processed into more stable forms like cheese and butter. Cheese, through its fermentation and aging process, became a long-lasting and valuable source of protein and fat. Butter could be clarified into ghee or heavily salted to extend its life. You might witness the laborious process of cheese making, the curds being pressed, the wheels of cheese being turned, all to ensure a supply of dairy through the lean months. For the nobility, however, fast days were an opportunity to showcase different forms of culinary extravagance. Instead of roasted boar, you might find fresh salmon, trout, or even sturgeon, often caught from the lord's own fish ponds or transported fresh from coastal towns. These fish were prepared with elaborate sauces, rich with herbs and spices, making them almost as luxurious as the meat dishes they replaced. Imagine a beautifully poached pike, its delicate white flesh served with a vibrant green herb sauce. It's a testament to the medieval cook's ingenuity in adhering to religious strictures while maintaining an impressive table. Fruits and vegetables, highly seasonal, also presented a challenge. Root vegetables could be stored in cool, dark cellars or root cellars, buried in sand or straw to keep them fresh for longer. Fruits were dried, made into preserves with honey, or fermented into ciders and wines. Pickling, using vinegar or brine, was another common method for vegetables like cabbage or cucumbers. Imagine the faint, sour smell of pickled vegetables, a sharp contrast to the fresh produce of summer. Eggs and dairy products, like cheese and milk, were also often permitted on fast days, providing valuable protein and fat. This meant that while meat was off the menu, the table was far from bare. Rich custards, cheese tarts, and omelets could still be served, offering variety and sustenance. You might find a platter of hard-boiled eggs, their yolks a vibrant yellow, a simple yet satisfying offering. One common historical fact that often surprises people is the prevalence of ergotism, a deadly disease caused by consuming rye grain contaminated with the ergot fungus. This fungus thrived in damp conditions and produced toxic alkaloids. Symptoms included intense burning sensations, St. Anthony's fire, hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene, often leading to death or limb loss. It was a terrifying, mysterious illness, often attributed to divine punishment, and a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in seemingly innocuous food. The concept of fasting in the medieval sense is often misunderstood by modern minds. It wasn't about starvation, but about self-discipline and moderation. It was a spiritual exercise, a way to purify the body and soul. However, the exact rules could vary. While meat was generally forbidden, some interpretations allowed for fowl like chickens or ducks or even certain types of waterfowl that were considered fish due to their aquatic habits. As we touched on earlier, remember that clever loophole about beavers being classified as fish? It's a classic example of how the wealthy could bend the rules without technically breaking them. Now, for a truly obscure detail did you know about soused dishes? This term referred to food, particularly fish or poultry, that was preserved by being cooked and then steeped in an acidic liquid like vinegar or verjuice, often with spices. It was a form of pickling that not only preserved the food but also added a tangy flavor. Imagine a piece of fish, cooked and then submerged in a spiced, vinegary brine, ready to be eaten days or even weeks later without further cooking. It sounds like a medieval version of ceviche or escabeche, a testament to culinary resourcefulness. Lent, the 40-day period leading up to Easter, was the most significant fasting season. During this time, not only was meat forbidden, but often dairy and eggs were also restricted, making the diet even more austere. It was a time of true deprivation, a stark reminder of humanity's dependence on God. You feel the pangs of hunger more acutely during Lent, the longing for a hearty meal a constant temptation. The lack of understanding about hygiene and microbiology meant that cross-contamination was rampant. Food was often prepared in unsanitary conditions, with little knowledge of proper hand washing or food handling. Flies, rodents, and other pests were constant companions in medieval kitchens and larders, further spreading disease. Imagine the constant battle against unseen enemies, a fight that medieval people were largely unaware they were even fighting. But then, after periods of fasting, came the feasting. And medieval feasts were truly legendary. They were not just meals, they were celebrations, social events, political gatherings, and displays of power. After the austerity of Lent, Easter brought an explosion of food. The tables would groan under the weight of roasted meats, rich stews, fine wines, and sweet pastries. It was a joyous release, a physical manifestation of spiritual renewal. The role of spices in masking the taste of spoilage, while often exaggerated, did play a part. If meat was slightly off, a heavy dose of cinnamon, cloves, or pepper could make it more palatable, though it wouldn't eliminate the underlying toxins. It was a culinary gamble, a way to salvage valuable food, but not a foolproof solution to foodborne illness. Imagine the contrast weeks of plain fish and vegetables, followed by a banquet featuring entire roasted oxen, wild boars, and dozens of fowl. The sheer abundance was overwhelming, a testament to the Lord's piety in observing the fast and his generosity in celebrating the feast. You see a roasted suckling pig, its skin crackling, surrounded by apples and herbs, a truly magnificent sight after weeks of abstention. The concept of food poisoning as a distinct illness was not understood. Instead, symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, and fever were often attributed to bad humors, divine displeasures, or simply bad air. This lack of understanding meant that the true cause of many illnesses went unrecognized, making prevention difficult. These feasts were also carefully choreographed affairs. The food was brought out in grand processions, often accompanied by music and entertainment. The dishes were designed not just to be eaten, but to be admired. Their elaborate presentations a form of edible art. The subtleties, those intricate marzipan sculptures or jellies, were particularly popular, showcasing the cook's skill and the host's wealth. Even water, as you recall, was a major source of contamination. The widespread consumption of ale and wine was a direct response to the dangers of drinking untreated water. This highlights the pervasive nature of food and drink safety issues in the medieval period. One common historical fact that often surprises people is the sheer number of saints' days and religious festivals that peppered the medieval calendar. Each of these often came with its own set of dietary rules, either mandating a fast or celebrating with a feast. It meant that the rhythm of eating was constantly shifting, a complex culinary calendar that everyone had to navigate. It wasn't just Fridays and Lent, it was a continuous cycle of observance. The methods of preservation were often labor-intensive and required significant resources. Salting required vast quantities of salt, which was itself a valuable commodity. Smoking required a steady supply of wood and constant tending of fires. These processes were integral to the medieval economy and daily life. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about chicken and bruet? This was a medieval dish often served on fast days. Despite its name, it was a type of chicken stew, but the bruet referred to a thick, spiced broth, and the chicken was often substituted with fish or even almond milk to make it suitable for fast days. It highlights the medieval cook's ability to adapt recipes to fit religious requirements, often creating dishes that blurred the lines between meat and non-meat. Imagine a creamy, savory stew that tastes surprisingly rich, even without meat. The constant threat of famine also influenced preservation practices. When a good harvest occurred, every effort was made to preserve the surplus, knowing that lean times were always just around the corner. This meant a focus on maximizing storage and minimizing waste. The lack of refrigeration meant that fresh produce was highly seasonal. You ate what was available when it was available. Surplus fruits and vegetables were preserved through drying, pickling, or fermentation. Root vegetables could be stored in cool, dark cellars for months. This reliance on seasonal eating meant that diets varied significantly throughout the year, with periods of relative abundance followed by long stretches of monotony. One academic debate still open to historians is the effectiveness of medieval preservation methods in truly preventing foodborne illness versus simply extending shelf life. While methods like salting and drying certainly inhibited microbial growth, they didn't eliminate all pathogens, and the risk of contamination during preparation and storage remained high. Some scholars argue that medieval people had a surprisingly robust immune system due to constant exposure. while others point to high rates of infant mortality and chronic illness as evidence of pervasive food-related health issues. It's a grim but fascinating area of study. The spiritual significance of food extended to the very act of eating. Grace was said before and after meals, and prayers were offered for the food. The sharing of food, especially with the poor, was considered an act of charity and piety. Even the waste from noble tables was often collected and distributed to the needy, a form of medieval social welfare. It was a constant reminder that food was a gift, not to be taken for granted. The use of fermentation was also a key preservation technique, often unknowingly. Beyond ale and wine, vegetables like cabbage were fermented into sauerkraut-like dishes, and milk into cheese or yogurt-like products. These processes not only preserved the food, but also added beneficial probiotics, and often enhanced nutrient availability. It was an accidental form of food science, born out of necessity. The church's influence on diet wasn't just about what you couldn't eat, it was also about what was considered appropriate. Gluttony was a sin, and while feasts were grand, there was an underlying expectation of moderation, at least in theory. Of course, human nature being what it is, moderation was often forgotten amidst the revelry. You might witness a lord, red-faced and jovial, calling for another goblet of wine, perhaps forgetting the spiritual implications of overindulgence. The medieval kitchen, particularly in a large household, was a constant battleground against spoilage. Cooks and their staff worked tirelessly to ensure food was prepared and stored correctly, but even with the best efforts, outbreaks of illness were common. Imagine the pressure on the head cook, knowing that a mistake could sicken an entire household. The distinction between meat and fish was often quite literal. Anything that came from the land and had blood was generally considered meat. Anything from the water was fish. This clear-cut distinction allowed for the consumption of a wide variety of aquatic animals, including whales, dolphins, and even certain birds that lived near water, on fast days. It's a fascinating example of how religious definitions shaped culinary practices. Even the way food was served could contribute to spoilage. Dishes were often left out for long periods during banquets, exposed to air and flies. Communal eating from trenchers or shared bowls also increased the risk of spreading illness. It was a social practice that, while fostering camaraderie, also facilitated the spread of pathogens. The economic impact of these fasting and feasting cycles was also significant. The demand for fish soared on fast days, driving up prices and creating a thriving fishing industry. Likewise, the demand for meat and other rich foods would surge before major feasts. This constant fluctuation in demand shaped agricultural practices and trade networks. It was a medieval food economy driven by faith. The concept of waste not, want not, was not just a saying, it was a survival imperative. Every scrap of food was valuable. Leftovers were repurposed. Bones boiled for broth. Stale bread used as thickeners. This extreme frugality was a direct response to the ever-present threat of scarcity and spoilage. The very structure of the medieval meal, particularly for the nobility, was often a reflection of the spiritual order. The most important guests sat at the high table, symbolizing their closeness to God, while the lower tables represented the rest of humanity. The food itself could be symbolic, with certain dishes representing virtues or religious figures. It was a subtle yet pervasive integration of faith into daily life. So, as you reflect on the medieval diet, remember that beneath the surface of gruel and grand feasts lay a constant struggle against the unseen forces of decay. The ingenuity of medieval people in preserving their food, even with limited knowledge, is a testament to their resilience. But the dark side of food, the peril of spoilage, was a shadow that loomed over every meal. A stark reminder of the fragile line between sustenance and sickness in a world without modern conveniences. One academic debate still open to historians is the long-term health impact of these alternating periods of fasting and feasting. Some scholars argue that the regular fasts, even if they involved eating fish and dairy, provided a necessary break from the rich, heavy, noble diet, potentially preventing some of the diseases of kings like gout from becoming even more prevalent. Others contend that the extreme swings between scarcity and abundance placed undue stress on the body, especially for the poor who might genuinely struggle during fasts. It's a complex question, with arguments rooted in both medical history and social conditions. You've journeyed through the medieval kitchen, from the bland gruel of the peasant to the spiced extravagance of the noble. From the spiritual dictates of fasting to the perilous reality of spoiled food. Now, as our journey nears its end, we must confront the most pervasive and terrifying aspect of medieval life. The constant, gnawing fear that shaped every decision about food, the shadow of hunger. In an era where survival was a daily struggle, famine was not a distant threat. It was a recurring nightmare, a brutal reality that could sweep through communities, leaving devastation in its wake. The role of monastic orders in shaping dietary practices is also crucial. Monasteries were often self-sufficient, with their own farms, fish ponds, and breweries. Their rules often dictated strict fasting, but also provided guidelines for healthy eating within those confines. They were innovators in food preservation and agricultural techniques, contributing significantly to the overall food culture of the time. You might imagine a monk quietly tending to his fish pond, ensuring a steady supply for the monastery's fast days. Imagine living with the constant awareness that your next meal, or even your very existence, was entirely dependent on the whims of nature. A late frost, an unseasonable drought, torrential rains, or a sudden plague of locusts. Any of these could decimate a harvest, plunging an entire region into starvation. For the medieval peasant, this wasn't an abstract concept, it was a lived experience. A generational trauma passed down through whispered stories and etched onto the gaunt faces of their elders. You feel a chill, not from the drafty hall, but from the chilling realization of this ever-present vulnerability. Even the types of grains consumed could be influenced by religious practices. While wheat was prized, barley and oats were often more common for the peasantry, and their use could be seen as a form of humility, especially during fasts. The simple, unadorned nature of peasant food often aligned more closely with the ideals of asceticism. The medieval agricultural system was inherently fragile. It relied almost entirely on manual labor and basic tools. Crop yields were low, and there was little surplus to cushion against bad years. If the grain harvest failed, there were few alternatives. Livestock could be slaughtered, but that depleted future resources. Foraging could provide some relief, but it was rarely enough to feed a large population. The delicate balance between population size and food production was constantly teetering on the brink. So, as you observe the ebb and flow of the medieval table, from the solemnity of a fast day to the exuberant joy of a feast, you realize that food was never just about satisfying hunger. It was a spiritual journey, a constant negotiation between the earthly and the divine. Your daily bread, or lack thereof, was a reflection of your faith, your status, and the intricate, all-encompassing power of the church. When famine struck, the consequences were horrific. People would first exhaust their stored provisions, then resort to eating anything remotely edible roots, bark, wild plants, even leather. Desperation would set in, leading to social breakdown, increased crime, and widespread disease as weakened bodies succumbed to illness. Imagine the hollow ache in your stomach, the dizziness, the desperate search for anything at all, to quiet the insistent pangs of hunger. It's a feeling that transcends time, a universal terror. You've navigated the intricate rules of fasting and feasting, understanding how faith shaped the medieval plate. Now, let's turn our attention to what filled the medieval goblet, a topic far more complex and often surprising than you might imagine. Forget your sparkling filtered water or your chilled sodas. In the medieval world, quenching your thirst was a daily gamble, and the liquid lifeblood of society flowed not from pristine springs, but from fermented grains and grapes. Your choice of drink, like your food, was a clear indicator of your social standing, and often a matter of survival. The impact of famine wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The constant anxiety, the fear of not being able to feed your children, the desperation of watching loved ones waste away, these left deep scars. It shaped communities, fostering both incredible resilience and sometimes brutal selfishness. It's a reminder that human nature, under extreme duress, can reveal both its best and worst aspects. Imagine a typical morning for a peasant. After that bland gruel, your throat feels dry. You reach for a wooden mug, not for water, but for ale. This isn't the strong, hoppy beer you might enjoy today. Medieval ale was a thick, often cloudy, low-alcohol brew, more akin to liquid bread. It was made from barley, oats, or rye, and brewed in the home or at a local alehouse. The fermentation process made it safer to drink than most water sources, which were often contaminated with human and animal waste. So, while it might not have been a refreshing glass of water, it was a practical, calorie-rich, and relatively safe way to hydrate. You take a long draft, the earthy, slightly sweet taste coating your tongue, providing a comforting warmth in your stomach. One common historical fact that often surprises people is that medieval famines were not isolated events, but a recurring feature of life, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries. The Great Famine of 1315 or 1317, for example, devastated much of northern Europe, leading to millions of deaths. It was caused by a period of unusually heavy rains and cold weather, which led to widespread crop failures. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a catastrophic multi-year event that reshaped society. For the peasant, whale was consumed throughout the day by men, women, and even children, though children would drink a much weaker version. It was a staple, providing not just hydration but also a significant portion of daily calories and some nutrients. Imagine drinking ale with every meal, and often between meals from dawn till dusk. Your modern liver might stage a protest, but for the medieval peasant, it was simply how you lived. The average person might consume several liters of ale a day. It's a staggering amount. But remember, the alcohol content was low, often less than 2%, making it closer to a modern non-alcoholic beer or kvass. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about hunger stones? These were markers, often large rocks in rivers or lakes, that would become visible during periods of extreme drought, revealing dangerously low water levels. People would carve dates and messages onto these stones, commemorating past famines and serving as grim warnings for future generations. Imagine walking past a riverbed, seeing these ancient stones emerge, each one a silent scream from a past generation, reminding you of the ever-present threat. It's like a historical check engine light for the entire ecosystem. Now, shift your gaze to the noble table. Here, the drink of choice is wine, imported from France, Italy, or local vineyards. Wine was a symbol of sophistication and wealth. It flowed freely, often watered down, especially for the morning or midday meals, to prevent excessive intoxication. But for banquets and celebrations, the wine would be stronger, richer, and consumed in vast quantities. You watch as a servant pours a deep red wine into a silver goblet, its rich aroma filling the air. This isn't just a drink, it's a statement. The economic consequences of famine were equally devastating. Food prices would skyrocket, making what little food was available unaffordable for the poor. Land values would plummet, and trade would grind to a halt. The entire social fabric would unravel as people migrated in desperate search of food, often spreading disease along the way. It was a vicious cycle, where hunger begot more hunger, and poverty deepened into destitution. The quality of wine varied wildly. There were rough, local wines for everyday consumption by the household staff, and fine, aged vintages for the lord and his most esteemed guests. Wine was also believed to have medicinal properties, warming the body and aiding digestion. It was a far more refined beverage than ale, reflecting the nobles' elevated status and their access to trade networks. Imagine the clinking of goblets, the laughter, the rich conversation, all fueled by the flowing wine. The role of the church during famines was complex. While monasteries often provided charity and relief, their resources were limited, and they couldn't alleviate the suffering of entire regions. Prayers and processions were common, as people desperately sought divine intervention, but often to little avail. It was a test of faith, a period where the limits of human and divine power were brutally exposed. Water, as a direct beverage, was generally viewed with suspicion. Rivers and wells were often polluted, especially in urban areas, while some rural areas might have had access to cleaner springs. The risk of disease from contaminated water was ever present. Boiling water was known to make it safer. But this was a laborious process, and the water would still taste flat and unappealing. So, while water was used for cooking and washing, it was rarely the primary drink of choice. You wouldn't just turn on a tap and fill a glass, it was a conscious decision to risk illness. The nobility, while better protected than the peasantry, were not entirely immune. Their vast stores of grain and their ability to import food could buffer them for a time. But prolonged famine would eventually impact even the wealthiest households. Their tenants, the source of their wealth, would die off, leading to labor shortages and economic ruin. Even a lord needed peasants to work his land. After all, it's a bit like a medieval CEO watching their entire workforce vanish. One common historical fact that often surprises people is that medieval people, including children, drank so much alcohol because it was safer than water. This is largely true, but it's important to remember the low alcohol content of most everyday brews. The fermentation process killed many harmful bacteria, making ale and weak wine a more reliable source of hydration. It wasn't about getting drunk all the time. It was about avoiding dysentery and other waterborne diseases that could quickly decimate a population. The concept of food security, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. There were no national reserves, no global aid organizations. Each community was largely on its own, dependent on its local harvest. This isolation made them incredibly vulnerable to localized disasters. A blight on the wheat in one valley could mean starvation for everyone living there. Now, for a truly obscure detail, did you know about posset? This was a popular medieval drink, especially among the nobility, made from hot milk curdled with wine or ale, often spiced with nutmeg, cinnamon, or ginger, and sometimes sweetened with sugar or honey. It was considered both a beverage and a light meal, often consumed before bed or given to the sick. Imagine a warm, spiced, slightly curdled milky wine. It sounds a bit odd to modern ears, but it was a comforting, nourishing drink, a medieval equivalent of a nightcap. The impact of warfare on food supply was also profound. Armies would often deliberately destroy crops and livestock to starve out the enemy, a brutal tactic known as scorched earth. This meant that even if the weather was good, war could bring famine to a region. Imagine your fields, painstakingly cultivated, being trampled and burned by passing soldiers, your future literally going up in smoke. The production of ale and wine was a massive industry. Every village had its alewife or brewer, and many monasteries produced their own beer and wine, often of high quality. Brewing was a domestic chore for many peasant women, while large-scale production for noble households or urban centers was a specialized craft. Vineyards flourished in many parts of Europe, their produce a valuable commodity. Imagine the rhythmic sounds of brewing, the bubbling of vats, the clinking of bottles, the earthy smell of fermenting grains. The memory of famine lingered for generations, shaping attitudes towards food. Every scrap was precious, every harvest a blessing. Waste was unthinkable. This ingrained frugality, born out of necessity, is a stark contrast to modern consumer habits. You find yourself instinctively picking up every last crumb, a habit born from centuries of scarcity. Cider, made from fermented apples, was also a popular drink in regions where apples were abundant, particularly in parts of England and France. It offered another alcoholic alternative to water and provided a refreshing, slightly tart flavor. It was a seasonal drink, enjoyed when apples were ripe and could be pressed. One academic debate still open to historians is the extent to which medieval famines were purely natural disasters versus being exacerbated by social and political factors. While climate change certainly played a role, some scholars argue that feudal land tenure systems, lack of infrastructure for food distribution, and the exploitative nature of some lord-peasant relationships intensified the suffering and prevented effective relief efforts. It's a discussion about whether hunger was solely an act of God or also a failure of human systems. Milk, while consumed, was often viewed with caution, especially raw milk, due to its rapid spoilage. It was more commonly used in cooking or processed into cheese, which was a safer and more storable form of dairy. Fresh milk was a treat, usually reserved for those with immediate access to dairy animals. The development of new agricultural techniques, like crop rotation and improved plowing methods, was often a direct response to the threat of famine. Innovations that could increase yields or make harvests more reliable were eagerly adopted, driven by the desperate need for more food. It was a slow, incremental process, but each small improvement offered a glimmer of hope. The social rituals surrounding drinking were also significant. Toasting, sharing cups, and elaborate drinking games were common, especially at feasts. Drinking was a communal activity, a way to bond, to celebrate, and sometimes to forget the harsh realities of medieval life. You might find yourself raising a goblet in a toast, the camaraderie of the moment a welcome respite. The demographic impact of famine was immense. It led to high mortality rates, particularly among the very young and the very old, and significantly reduced birth rates. It could take decades for a population to recover from a major famine. If it ever fully did, it was a brutal form of population control, a stark reminder of humanity's precarious position in the natural world. The quality of water, even for the wealthy, was a constant concern. While castles might have had their own wells, these could still be contaminated. Some cities invested in elaborate aqueducts to bring cleaner water from distant sources, but these were rare and expensive undertakings. For most, the nearest river or communal well was the primary source, and the risks were well understood, even if the germ theory of disease was not. Even the diseases that accompanied famine were a direct consequence of malnutrition. Weakened bodies were highly susceptible to infections, and epidemics often followed periods of widespread hunger. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses would sweep through the starving population, claiming even more lives. It was a horrifying synergy of hunger and disease. The concept of small beer or table beer is also important. This was a very weak, low-alcohol ale brewed specifically for daily consumption, including by children. It was essentially a safer form of hydration than water, providing minimal intoxicating effects. It was the medieval equivalent of a soft drink, but with a slight alcoholic kick. The psychological resilience required to live under the constant shadow of hunger is almost unimaginable. To wake up every day, knowing that a single bad season could mean the end of everything you hold dear, yet still to toil, to plant, to hope. It speaks volumes about the human spirit. You feel a profound respect for the sheer tenacity of medieval people, their ability to endure unimaginable hardship. One academic debate still open to historians is the long-term health effects of a diet so heavily reliant on alcoholic beverages, even low-alcohol ones. Some scholars argue that while it prevented waterborne diseases, the constant consumption of even weak alcohol could have had subtle, chronic impacts on liver health, nutrient absorption, and overall well-being. Others contend that the benefits of avoiding contaminated water far outweighed these potential drawbacks, and that medieval bodies were simply more accustomed to processing alcohol? It's a complex question, difficult to answer definitively without modern medical data. The communal nature of medieval society, while sometimes breaking down during extreme famine, also offered a degree of protection. Neighbors would often share what little they had, understanding that their own survival might depend on such generosity in the future. It was a fragile safety net, but a safety net nonetheless. The act of brewing and winemaking was often imbued with a sense of tradition and even magic. Certain rituals were followed, and the success of a batch was often attributed to divine favor or the skill of the brewer rather than purely scientific principles. It was an art form passed down through generations, essential to the daily life of the community. You might observe an alewife carefully tending her brew, her movements precise and practiced, a quiet reverence in her actions. So, as you reflect on the medieval diet, from its daily monotony to its grand celebrations, remember that all of it, every bite and every sip, was framed by the ever-present shadow of hunger. It was a world where food was not a given, but a hard-won victory, a constant struggle against the forces of nature and the fragility of human existence. The awful truth about medieval diets is not just what they ate, but the terrifying reality of what they often lacked. Even in times of scarcity, the production of ale and wine often continued, sometimes at the expense of grain for bread. This highlights the vital role these beverages played in the medieval diet and culture. They weren't just luxuries, they were necessities.